A chest was recently rediscovered hidden away in the archives of a university library. I'm not going to say which university it is, only that it's been around for centuries. The chest contains dozens of letters, journal entries, and other such primary resources. These documents span from being decades to centuries old. We're not sure if these documents were gathered together to be hidden or to be found. My fellow colleagues and I have been assigned the task of deciphering and analyzing these documents. The first item we have chosen has been carbon-14 dated to the 14th century, which matches up to the subject matter within the document. Based on a variety of methods, we've determined that it was written sometime between the years 1350 and 1355 in a currently unknown town in England, suffering from the Black Death pandemic. It is a letter written on parchment by a parish priest. It outlines the plague's horrific effects on the town and describes the arrival of a plague doctor. The letter contains information that greatly challenges historical accounts of the Black Death. In fact, in some ways, it challenges what we know about everything. As such, it is very controversial amongst my colleagues. While some are currently in debate over whether we should dismiss it entirely and pretend we have never read it at all, I have decided to leak its contents below. A few points before I get started. While the letter was written in Latin, we have translated as best we can into modern English, even though the vernacular language at the time would be Old English. Point 2. Plague doctors. Plague doctors wore an eerie costume consisting of dark black robes and a mask with a long beak, resembling that of a bird. They filled the long beak up with herbs and flowers that they thought protected them from the spread of disease, and to aid in quelling the stench of death, even though it's now known that the plague spread through flea-ridden rats. The below letter is the earliest known reference to such plague doctors. The top few lines of the letter have become illegible, so it begins abruptly. And so I will now relay to you the letter previously described. The document that my colleagues and I have started calling the Plague Doctor was pillaged by plague. The hardships faced by the townsfolk have been insurmountable. Their faith has been challenged, possibly beyond repair. Plague-ridden parishioners have flocked to my church, begging for anything thy Lord can offer. Their lips and fingertips blackened from disease. They reveal to me the large growths that emerged on their necks, in their armpits, and on their groins. Signs that they have little time left. There is little solace I can offer them. I recall a woman carrying her dying child. He was vomiting blood, an impossible amount. Blood began leaking from his eyes. He died as we both watched on helplessly. She asked me in hysterics what kind of God would allow such things. I told her that she spoke heresy, that his ways should not be questioned, that these are but tests of our faith. Even though I spoke the words, even I myself remain unconvinced. We had sent word for a plague doctor months prior, but have since heard no response. Rumor was that all of the known world was suffering at least as greatly, and that a doctor would arrive as soon as availability permitted. But before one arrived, it looked as though our prayers had been answered. Day by day, there were less and less cases of the plague. Our town, while losing a third of its population, had survived this outbreak. We've heard so many stories of entire cities being completely obliterated, so we truly considered ourselves lucky. Weeks had gone by without any new cases appearing, and that's when the plague doctor arrived. He offered the people a safety that they knew I could not provide to them. His arrival created a feverish and impassioned joy from the townsfolk, the death and horror from the previous month still fresh on their minds. They thought he guaranteed their safety in the future. The first time I saw him, he was walking through the town towards my parish. He was a massive man, towering as tall as 7 grown men's feet. He was adorned a black robe and a felt hat. He brandished a long cane. And of course, he was protected behind a long-beaked bird-like mask. Something I can only assume offered him some protection against the infection. As he made his way down the street, some female townsfolk ran towards him. His presence made them almost drunk in elation, in hope. They were crying, screaming, and clutching towards him. The plague doctor took his cane and beat them away. Mercilessly. He was apologetic afterwards, claiming he needed to be extra cautious as to remain free of the plague. The people understood, but from what I saw, he almost seemed to take pleasure in those beatings. The plague doctor arrived at my parish. I offered him my hand, but he pushed past me. He said we had business to attend to. He asked many questions. He was not interested in the victims. He was not interested in the symptoms, suffering, or ways we could deal with the disease itself. No. He was interested in why the town had so many survivors. He wondered if there was a local doctor or someone offering an effective treatment. I explained that I had no knowledge of such things. I explained to him that our town had faith, that we prayed, and that our prayers had been answered. I may be wrong and I can't be certain, but I believe he quietly laughed under his mask when I said that. And that leads me to the concerns I had with this doctor. No one in the town learned his name. He wore a pendant around his neck that was not a relic of faith. I inquired about it, but he ignored me outright. His overall posture and movement seemed peculiar. The raspiness of his voice as he spoke frightened me. I began to question whether he, or it, was even wearing a mask at all. In all the days that I was with him, I never once saw him eat, drink, or relieve himself. It was unsettling being near him. So I had to hide my excitement when, after 3 days of questioning and investigating, he said that he would be leaving the following morning. I asked him what he had learned, and he replied,
"A great deal."
He would not say any more. I woke up before sunrise the next morning. I decided I would meet the plague doctor in the center of town to say our farewells. I was wary of seeing him again, but as a man of God, I must always act in a proper manner. I made my way over just as dawn was beginning to break. Nobody else in the town was about. It was silent. I saw the doctor, standing beside the wagon he would be departing on. He was holding a small, rectangular object up to his mask, by his ear. He was speaking into the object. It was a language I had never heard before. The plague doctor then went to the underside of the wagon. I could hear the squealing already. He opened a series of cages. Dozens of rats poured into the street. I stepped out at that point and asked what was happening. The plague doctor turned and stared at me. I could tell he was rattled by my abrupt appearance. I knew for a certainty that he was trying to decide what to do with me, whether he would let me live or not. After a moment, he relaxed and said that it was a new theory and that I simply wouldn't understand. He got into the wagon. He left. He never returned. And within a few short days, the plague struck our town again. Far worse than before. It ravished the town. People were no longer disposing of bodies. The center of town was littered with corpses. For a while, I believed I was the only one in town free of the plague. And then I noticed the first signs. Cold sweats and achy joints. I write this now in a town of death and foulness. I have but hours to live. I will leave this letter in hopes that the diocese will send someone here to investigate. If you're reading this, spread this message far and wide. These men, they are not doctors. They're demons. They are not of God's image. They are not fighting this plague. They are the harbingers of it. And it's the rats. This plague, this bearer of death and turmoil, it's somehow transmitted through the rats. God help us. God help us all. So you can probably see why this has created such controversy amongst my colleagues. At the moment, we are unsure how the other documents in the chest relate to each other. But as we work on other documents, I will continue to leak them if I can. And maybe together, we can connect all the dots.